He called me senile, as if the word were nothing more than a napkin tossed aside after dinner. And the worst part wasn't the insult itself. No, at my age, insults lose their sharpness. It was how the room reacted. A few lowered eyes, a few awkward smiles, and one loud laugh from someone who'd been waiting for permission to laugh at me for years. I stood there with the serving spoon in my hand, the steam from the potatoes rising between us like a thin curtain. And I understood. They had long stopped seeing me as someone who hears, feels, or remembers. I placed the spoon back into the bowl carefully. A small gesture, but it helped me steady my breath. "Thomas," I said quietly, looking at my son-in-law the way a teacher looks at a rude child. "I heard you." He waved a hand flippantly. "Mom, relax. It's just a joke. You're so sensitive these days." Sensitive. Senile. Too old to understand nuance. Too slow to keep up. It all wrapped into one tidy box with my name on it. I looked at my daughter, Caroline. She adjusted her bracelet, as if it were suddenly too tight, and avoided my eyes. That hurt more than Thomas's words. She used to defend me fiercely as a girl. Now she stood beside him, as if she'd been handed a new role. The modern wife who must not embarrass her husband by having a mother who speaks her mind. The guests shifted in their chairs. Someone cleared their throat. The roasted chicken was cooling on the table. Every meal I make cools faster these days, as if even food feels the tension in this house. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. A woman of 74 learns long ago that shouting does nothing but waste breath she might need later. I simply gathered the used plates, stacking them neatly, and carried them to the sink. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. Only inside, something old and quiet, a thread pulled tight through the years, finally snapped. Thomas kept talking behind me. He always talks too loudly after humiliating someone. It's a way to fill the silence he fears. "People know what I mean," he said to the room. "Older folks get confused. It's normal. No offense." Older folks. I had spent 40 years working in a library, handling manuscripts older than his entire family tree, but apparently I get confused. I washed one plate, then another. The water was warm, the kind of warmth that makes a woman think clearly. I remembered my husband. Steady, calm, never cruel. And how he used to say, "Martha, dignity isn't noise. It's choosing when to speak and when not to stay silent." For years after he passed, I tried to hold this family together with my quiet presence. I helped with down payments, car repairs, tuition fees. All the little holes in their lives I patched without complaint. They mistook my silence for simplicity, my patience for weakness, my generosity for obligation. I wiped my hands on a towel, took a breath, and returned to the dining room. The room hushed. Funny how they quiet down when the old woman walks in, as if I might suddenly forget where I am or what's been said. "I'm going home," I announced. No anger, no tremor, just a statement. Caroline finally looked up. "Mom, don't be dramatic. Thomas didn't mean anything." "I know exactly what he meant," I replied. Thomas smirked. That lazy smirk men get when they believe the battle is already theirs. He thought I was leaving because my feelings were hurt. He thought it ended there. But as I picked up my coat, something settled inside me. A decision. A clarity that arrives only when a woman has been pushed past the final line she spent years pretending didn't exist. They thought they knew what I would do. They thought I would go home, cry a little, forgive a lot, and return next Sunday with another casserole. But they had no idea that earlier that week, before any insult, before any raised voice, I had already met with my lawyer. And tonight, as I closed their front door behind me, I knew this. The next time they saw me in that house, nothing in it would belong to them the way they believed. The house was cold when I stepped inside, though the thermostat insisted it was 72. Grief has its own temperature, and so does humiliation. I hung my coat on the same wooden peg my husband used for decades, and for a moment my hand rested there, remembering the weight of his jacket, the faint smell of cedar he always carried with him. "Help them, Martha, but don't lose yourself," he used to say. I had done the first part faithfully. The second, not so much. The kitchen greeted me with silence, the kind that settles only in the homes of older women who live alone. I put the kettle on out of habit, though I didn't want tea. What I wanted was steadiness, something warm to hold so my thoughts wouldn't tremble the way my hands wanted to. On the dining table lay the framed photograph of Richard, my husband, and me at our 45th anniversary dinner. He was leaning slightly toward me, as if listening to something only I could say. I touched the glass gently. "You'd laugh at them," I murmured. Not loudly, but in that way you had. That little sigh that meant, "I warned you." But the truth was, he never warned me about this. He never imagined Caroline would become a woman who avoids her own mother's eyes. He never imagined she'd marry a man like Thomas, all slick shirts and louder opinions, a man who mistook cruelty for confidence. I sat down, letting the chair creak under me. Chairs tell the truth better than people. They don't pretend. Last night's scene replayed itself whether I wanted it to or not. The way Thomas's voice cut through the room, the smirk afterward, as if he'd finally said what everyone else was thinking, the way Caroline pressed her napkin, pretending not to hear. It wasn't the first time, of course. These things rarely begin in one moment. They build slowly, like dust in corners you no longer bend down to see. For years, I allowed the comments, the sighs, the patronizing tone, the quiet exclusions. "You don't need to worry about this, Mom. You wouldn't understand the paperwork. It's confusing for people your age." Little stones placed gently on my shoulders until my back began to bend. I got up and walked to the living room, where the late afternoon light was falling across the old bookshelf Richard built with his own hands. My eyes drifted to the bottom drawer, the one I rarely opened. Inside, neatly stacked, were all the documents I had gathered over the past months. Bank statements, property deeds, trust drafts, medical directives. Work I had done quietly, privately, without telling a soul. Not out of spite. Not then, but out of necessity. A woman living alone must think ahead, because no one else will. I pulled out the envelope marked E.J. Law Offices, Revised Draft. My lawyer, Mr. Jeffries, had insisted on two things that day. Don't make decisions based on guilt. Don't wait until people force your hand. I hadn't told him that my hand had already been forced for years. I set the envelope on the coffee table but didn't open it. Instead, I sat back and looked around the room that had held a whole lifetime. Quilts sewn by my mother. A clock Richard fixed so many times it ticked with a tiny stutter. Caroline's school drawings, still framed on the hallway wall because I never had the heart to take them down. When did my daughter stop being mine? When did she become someone I had to tiptoe around? I leaned back, letting my head rest against the cushion. The kettle whistled faintly from the kitchen, But I didn't get up. Let it whistle. Let it go cold. Today wasn't about tea. Today was about clarity. For the first time, I allowed myself to think without excuses on her behalf. Caroline had changed long before Thomas walked into her life. She learned to admire hardness, mistaking it for strength. She learned to measure people by usefulness, not tenderness. She learned to keep distance from anything that reminded her of vulnerability, including me. And I, foolish as I was, kept trying to buy my way back into her grace. A little help with the mortgage, a loan for the car, tuition for their son, Evan. A steady trickle of money, each check written with the hope, no, the illusion, that gratitude might soften them. It never did. I closed my eyes. The house hummed quietly, and somewhere outdoors a dog barked. Life went on, indifferent to my embarrassment. But I wasn't embarrassed anymore. Not really. I was awake. Thomas's words had not crushed me. They had clarified me. As if someone wiped dust off a window I thought had been clean. I rose to my feet, slowly, deliberately. A small stiffness in my knees reminded me that age has its taxes, but it also has its freedoms. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Jeffries. Tomorrow, I would sign the final documents. But tonight, I would allow myself the rarest luxury, to sit in my own home, in my own silence, without apology. Because dignity, I realized, isn't a gift others give you. It's something you reclaim when the world forgets you still own it. Carolyn called the next morning, though not to ask how I was feeling. She never asks that anymore. "Mom, listen," she began. Her voice clipped, already defensive, as if she'd been rehearsing. "About last night. You took things too personally." I sat at my kitchen table, the phone pressed to my ear, watching dust drift lazily in a sunbeam. Amazing how something so quiet can feel more alive than your own daughter. "I heard what was said," I replied calmly. She exhaled sharply, the kind of sigh people make when dealing with a stubborn cashier or a slow waiter. Thomas was joking. Everyone understood that. You should have stayed to finish dinner instead of making a scene. A scene. Leaving the room with a coat on my arm was a scene. I looked around my kitchen. The ceramic tiles Richard laid down himself. The curtains I stitched one winter when money was too tight for store-bought ones. Every corner whispered memories. Caroline's voice did not belong here the way it once did. "Caroline," I said softly, "when your husband calls me senile, the only scene is the one he created. Silence. Not reflective silence. The cold one. The calculating kind." "You know how he gets when he's stressed," she finally said. "You shouldn't escalate things. At your age—" She stopped too late. Those words had already landed. "At your age." I felt something like a dry twig bend inside me. Not break, just bend in a way that warned, one more inch, and it will snap. "My age has nothing to do with dignity," I said, "or respect." "Well," she muttered, "we see things differently." Oh, yes. We did. When Caroline was 13, she used to cling to my arm during thunderstorms, whispering that she'd never leave me, that she'd buy a house next door so we'd always be close. But adulthood rearranges hearts. She drifted gradually, quietly, like a boat loosening from a dock rope someone forgot to tighten. "You didn't defend me," I said, not accusingly, just naming it, like pointing at a stain on a shirt. "I didn't want to embarrass Thomas," she snapped. "He was hosting, people were watching." "I'm your mother," I reminded her, my voice steady. "Not an inconvenience on the guest list." She scoffed softly. "Mom, please don't start with guilt trips. It's manipulative." I almost laughed from the irony. Me? Manipulative. A woman who has spent decades softening every truth just to keep peace. I'm not guilt-tripping anyone, I said. I'm stating what happened. She grew quiet again, but this silence felt different. The silence of someone who realizes the conversation isn't going the way they planned. So what now? She asked. Are you going to hold this over us forever? No, I said. I don't hold things. I release them. She didn't understand. Not yet. I heard muffled voices on her end. Thomas, of course, asking something in that irritated bark he uses when things slip from his control. Caroline covered the phone with her hand, whispered back to him, then returned to me. We want things to go back to normal, she said. But you need to stop being so sensitive. You're making things bigger than they are. Normal, sensitive, senile. All synonyms, apparently, in the dictionary of people who outgrow the ones who raised them. Caroline, I said quietly, normal hasn't been good for me in a very long time. What's that supposed to mean? She asked sharply, but before I could answer, she added, Anyway, we'll come by Sunday. Maybe we can talk then. No, I said. Sunday won't work for me. The surprise in her voice was almost comical. Why not? Because Sunday, I would be at my lawyer's office, signing the final will. The one neither she nor Thomas imagined existed. The one that didn't include them the way they assumed. But I didn't say any of that. I simply said, I have plans. Plans? Caroline repeated, as if the word didn't belong in the vocabulary of a 74-year-old woman. Yes, I said. Plans. She went silent again, the longest silence yet, then curtly, Fine, we'll reschedule. No apology, no remorse, not even a shadow of self-reflection, just entitlement, smooth, polished, effortless. Take care, I told her. She hung up without saying it back. I set the phone down and sat for a moment, breathing in the stillness of my own home. My chest didn't ache. My hands didn't shake. Instead, I felt something new bloom quietly inside me. Something steady, something warm, something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. Respect for myself. The kind I'd misplaced along the way while trying to keep peace in a war no one else acknowledged. I folded my dish towel, smoothed its corners, and thought, they think last night was the end of it. They have no idea it was only the beginning. I woke early the next morning, long before the sun bothered to climb over the rooftops. At my age, you don't sleep the way you used to. Rest becomes lighter. Thoughts become heavier. I lay there for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the hallway clock. It had ticked through births, deaths, holidays, disappointments. It ticked the same now as if nothing had shifted in my world. But everything had. I rose slowly, joints arguing with me the way they do most mornings, and went to the kitchen. I brewed coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because the ritual itself steadies me. Scoop, pour, wait. A simple order in a life where so much had slipped out of order. I carried my cup to the window and sat at the small table Richard built decades ago, the one with a faint scratch from the time Caroline dropped a fork during one of her childhood tantrums. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else's daughter. The girl she used to be and the woman she is now. I often struggle to reconcile them. Outside, the neighborhood was waking. Mrs. Farnham across the street was already sweeping her porch. Her life is simple, quiet. No grown children demanding loans, no son-in-law evaluating her worth by how little she inconveniences him. Some might pity a lonely widow. They don't understand. Loneliness is not the worst fate. Being surrounded by people who treat you poorly, that is far lonelier. I sipped my coffee and looked around my living room. The quilt my mother made, frayed at the edges. The photograph of Richard holding our newborn daughter. The sofa we bought secondhand during a year we could barely afford groceries. The box where I kept every letter Caroline ever wrote me from college. That box hadn't been opened in years. I reached for it now. I brought it to the table and untied the ribbon. Her handwriting stared back at me. Round, earnest, untouched by the cynicism that would shape her later. Mom, I miss you. I can't wait to come home for Thanksgiving. You always know how to calm me down. I don't know what I'd do without you, without me. Funny how children grow up and forget the very truth they once clung to. I put the letters away. Nostalgia is a soft blanket, but it can suffocate you if you're not careful. I'd had enough suffocation for one lifetime. Instead, I walked through my house slowly, taking in the pieces of my life the way a curator studies her museum. These rooms didn't just carry my memories. They carried my effort, my sacrifices. The nights I stayed awake helping Caroline with projects. The mornings I left for work early so she'd never know how tight money was. The promises I kept, even when she forgot hers. And for years, I let her and Thomas behave as if everything I had were simply theirs waiting in escrow. Last month, Thomas suggested, in that smooth, oily tone of his, that it would be practical for me to transfer the deed of my house to them for future planning. He framed it like a kindness. Makes things easier later on, he'd said, smiling as if he were offering a gift rather than taking one. I'd laughed softly at the time, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood the kind of man he was and the kind of blindness Caroline chose. He didn't want my house out of love. He wanted control. He wanted to be the one deciding where I live, how much independence I'm allowed. That was the day I emailed Mr. Jeffries. I sat down at my desk now, the morning sun creeping in, warming the papers scattered across its surface. Bank documents, notes from my meetings with the lawyer, draft versions of the trust. All neatly organized, all ready for a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. People underestimate older women. They assume our minds fade just because our bodies slow. But my mind had never been sharper than in the moment Thomas called me senile. His insult didn't bruise me. It clarified me. I opened the drawer where I kept the most recent version of the will. I didn't read it. I knew every line by heart. Instead, I placed my hand flat on top of it, grounding myself. This house, this money, this life, I had earned every inch of it, and I would decide its future. Somewhere in another neighborhood, I imagined Caroline sipping her morning smoothie, retelling the story of the night before in a tone halfway between annoyance and embarrassment. Mom really overreacted, she might say. She's getting sensitive. It's part of aging. Oh, how wrong she was. People think aging makes you fragile. In truth, it strips away everything unnecessary: pride, fear, hesitation, and leaves you with something pure: resolve. My phone buzzed once. A message from Aiden, my grandson. "Grandma, are you free later? I'd like to visit." I felt a smile soften my face. That boy, the only one who still speaks to me with sincerity, who sees me not as an obligation, but as a person. "Yes," I wrote back. "I'd like that very much." I stood, smoothing my sweater, and looked at my quiet home. For the first time in a long while, It didn't feel like a place I was waiting to leave someday. It felt like a place I was choosing to protect. Mr. Jeffrey's office always smells faintly of old paper and polished wood. A comforting smell, the kind that reminds you the world hasn't spun entirely off its axis. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do. At 74, punctuality becomes something like armor. It tells people you're still in command of your own time, even if they believe otherwise. The receptionist, a young woman with bright red lipstick, smiled at me politely, but with that softness people reserve for the elderly. Careful? Too careful. Mrs. Eldwood, he'll be with you in a moment. I nodded and took a seat in the waiting area. A young couple sat across from me, whispering to each other about prenups and honeymoon plans. They didn't look at me, but I watched them. Two people at the beginning of something, unaware of how complicated the middle can get. When Mr. Jeffries finally appeared, he greeted me with a warm, respectful handshake. Not the limp, patronizing grip I get from Thomas when he wants to feel superior. "Martha," he said, "come in." His office was lined with bookshelves, case files neatly arranged, a place of order, of decisions. He motioned for me to sit, then settled into his leather chair. "I wasn't expecting you again so soon," he said, "but I had a feeling you might return after our last conversation." I folded my hands in my lap. Some things became clearer since then. He studied me for a moment. He's a man who watches more than he speaks. It's why I trust him. "Well," he said gently, "I gathered from your message that you're ready to finalize the will." I nodded. "I am." "And the trust?" he asked. "You still want it structured so that no one except your grandson has access?" "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." He didn't question it. Instead, he opened a folder, my folder, thick with weeks of drafts, notes, and revisions. "Before we go through it," he said carefully, "may I ask, did something happen?" I looked at him, surprised by the sting behind my answer. Someone called me senile in front of others. Someone who should have known better. He didn't offer pity. Thank God for that. Pity is a heavy, useless thing. "I'm sorry you experienced that," he said simply. "But I'm glad you're here. Decisions made in clarity, not reaction. Those are the ones that stand." I almost smiled. "Oh, Mr. Jeffries, this decision has been forming for years. Last night only reminded me I'm done being anyone's afterthought." He nodded respectfully, then turned the document toward me. "As we discussed, the house remains yours until your passing. Upon that time, it goes into a protected trust for Aiden. He cannot sell or transfer it until he turns 30 to ensure no one pressures him. Your savings accounts follow the same structure. Medical directives designate him as your health proxy, if you're still comfortable with that." I felt a warmth move through me. Yes, he's the only one who listens. "And your daughter?" he asked cautiously. "Do you want to leave something symbolic?" I thought about the woman who used to braid my hair when she was a child, who once sobbed on my shoulder over her first heartbreak. The woman who now winces when I speak too long at dinner, who defends a man who belittles me. "I'll leave her a letter," I said finally. "But not money." He closed the folder with a soft thud. "A letter carries more weight than a check in cases like these." I breathed out slowly. Not relief, certainty. "Now," he continued, "I'll need your signatures on several pages. We'll notarize them today. After that, no one can contest this without serious legal grounds." That mattered. Thomas is the kind of man who believes persistence is the same thing as entitlement. I had no interest in giving him loopholes. He slid the first page toward me. My hand hovered for a moment, not from doubt, but from the realization of how long I had postponed this. How many times I'd quieted my own needs so others could feel comfortable. How many meals I'd cooked, how many checks I'd written, how many humiliations I'd endured in silence, hoping for gratitude that never came. I picked up the pen. My signature came out steady, cleaner than I expected. "One more here," he said, and another, and another. Each line felt like a stitch, repairing something inside me I hadn't known was torn. When we finished, Mr. Jeffries gathered the papers with reverence. "Well, Martha," he said softly, "you've done something today that many people never find the courage to do." I met his eyes. I didn't do it for courage. I did it for peace. "That," he said, "is courage." I stood slowly, my knees protesting as they always do, and he walked me to the door. "If anything changes," he added, "you call me. But from this point forward, everything is legally sealed." Outside, the daylight felt sharper, as if the world had come into better focus. I walked down the steps of the law office with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just settled. Not because I'd punished anyone. That was never the point. But because, for the first time, I had chosen myself. Aiden arrived just after lunch. Tall, a little awkward in his movements, always ducking his head to kiss my cheek, as if afraid his height might overwhelm me. He smelled faintly of laundry detergent and library books. His presence brought a softness into the house I hadn't felt in a long time. "Grandma," he said, stepping inside and setting his backpack by the door. "You all right? You sounded different this morning." Different. He noticed. Out of everyone, he noticed. "I'm fine, dear," I said, smoothing my sweater and trying not to smile too much. "Sit down. I'll make tea." He followed me into the kitchen and leaned against the counter while the kettle heated. "Mom said you left dinner early last night," he said carefully. "She said Thomas made a joke you didn't like." A joke. That's what she'd called it. I reached for the teacups, the good ones, not the everyday ones. I don't know why. Maybe because Aiden makes me feel like someone worth serving something delicate to. "Thomas didn't make a joke," I said quietly. "He insulted me. And your mother didn't correct him." Aiden's jaw tightened. He tried to hide it, but I saw. That boy doesn't hide emotion well. It lives right on his face, honest as morning light. "Grandma," he said slowly, "I'm sorry." I waved him off. "You didn't do it." "No," he said, "but someone should have apologized. Someone should have stood up for you." His words settled inside me like a warm stone, heavy but comforting. I placed the cups on the table, poured tea, and sat across from him. "You've always seen me clearly," I told him. He shrugged, looking down. "You raised me. You're the only one who ever listened." I watched him sip his tea, careful, respectful, and felt something shift inside me, the same shift I'd felt when signing the will. A quiet knowing. "Aiden," I said, "tell me honestly, how do your parents treat me when I'm not around?" He froze, then sighed. A real sigh, not the polished one Caroline uses when she wants to end a conversation. "They don't talk badly about you," he said. "Not directly, but they dismiss you. Like you don't understand things. Like you're a burden." Burden. There it was. The word I'd felt pressed against me for years, finally spoken aloud. "They think you're too fragile," he continued. "Too old-fashioned." Mom says you get overwhelmed. Thomas says you shouldn't live alone anymore. I closed my eyes briefly. I knew they thought these things, but hearing them in someone else's voice tightened something in my chest. When I opened them, Aiden was watching me closely. But I don't think that, he added quickly. Not for a second. I know. My voice was softer than I expected. You've never treated me like I'm fading. He smiled. Shy, boyish, the way he did when he was 12 and brought me a broken alarm clock to fix because he believed I could fix anything. Grandma, he said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Do you still plan to leave the house to Mom someday? She talks about it like it's certain. I set my teacup down. Slowly, deliberately. Aiden, I said, what do you think is fair? He blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. I never thought I should have anything. You've already done so much for me. And for them, I said. Far more than they realize. He nodded, staring at his hands. I don't want anything, he said finally. Really. I just want you to be okay. I want you to be treated the way you deserve. A warmth rose in my throat. Not tears, but something older, deeper. Recognition. Gratitude. Love. The kind that doesn't need repayment. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. You're the only one who comes to see me without needing something, I said. Do you know how rare that is? He swallowed hard. I just like being here. I like you being here, I replied. The kettle clicked again behind us as it cooled. Outside, the neighborhood children were shouting, their laughter running past my windows like a reminder that life continues, careless and bright. Aiden, I said after a long moment, if one day, not soon, but someday, you are given responsibility for this home, would you take care of it? Not for its value, but for what it holds? He looked up. His eyes, brown, gentle, steady, met mine. Yes, he said. No hesitation. I would take care of it. And of you, if you ever needed it. I nodded slowly. My decision felt less like a choice and more like a truth revealing itself. Good, I said. That's all I needed to know. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't press. He simply sat with me, drinking his tea, letting the silence rest between us in a way that felt natural, warm, unforced. Later, when he left, he hugged me, properly, fully, and said, "See you tomorrow, Grandma," as if it were the most ordinary thing. But after the door closed, I stood there for a long time. Not because I felt lonely, but because for the first time in years, I felt understood. And that, more than any inheritance, was worth holding on to. They came to me sooner than I expected, not with apologies, of course, but with needs disguised as conversation. It always begins that way. A phone call, a softened tone, a question wrapped in concern. Caroline arrived first. No warning, just the sound of her car door slamming and footsteps on my porch. I opened the door before she knocked. "Mom," she said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Can we talk?" We sat in the living room. She looked around, noticing, as she always did, the things she planned to inherit one day. The antique cabinet, the rug Richard bought with his first bonus, the house itself. She folded her hands neatly. Thomas and I were thinking, maybe you could help us bridge a short-term gap, just for a few months. There it was, the real reason. What gap? I asked. She hesitated, choosing her words. The loan we took for the patio remodel ended up being higher than expected. And with Evan's new program at school... Caroline, I interrupted gently, why didn't you wait until you could afford it? A flicker of irritation crossed her face. Everyone upgrades their home. It's not unreasonable, and you've always helped. Yes, that was the problem. I looked at her carefully. Really looked. This was my daughter, but I no longer saw the girl she used to be. I saw a woman who viewed generosity as duty, love as transaction. I won't be contributing this time, I said quietly. She stared at me, startled. Why? Are you upset about the dinner? I explained. I heard your explanation, I replied. And my answer stands. Her lips tightened. Mom, this isn't like you. No, I said. It isn't. But it should have been. She opened her mouth, closed it, then leaned back as if physically pushed. Thomas said this might happen, she murmured. That you'd start withholding, as if kindness were a faucet and I'd turned it off to spite her. Caroline, I said softly, for years you've come to me only when something was needed. Money, babysitting, signing things you didn't want to read. Did you ever come just to visit? Her gaze drifted away. Silence answered for her. Before she could respond, Thomas appeared at my doorway, bold as brass, not even bothering to hide his annoyance. He didn't knock. He didn't greet me. He simply stepped inside as if he owned the hinge on my front door. Caroline, he said sharply, are we doing this or not? Then, catching my eyes, he added with a tight smile, Hi, Mom. Mom. He used that word the way one uses a placeholder, something to fill the space without meaning it. We're discussing it, Caroline said. No, we aren't, I corrected softly. I've already given my answer. Thomas let out a laugh, short, dismissive. All right, let's not be dramatic. It's a simple request. You help, things move smoothly. You don't help, well, it complicates everything. There was a tone in his voice, a warning, a hint of threat wrapped in casualness. The kind of tone men use when they believe the woman in front of them has nowhere else to turn. But I wasn't the woman he thought he knew. Thomas, I said, I'm not responsible for your finances or your decisions. His jaw tightened. You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be. No, I said, my voice steady. I'm finally making it clear. Caroline looked between us, her eyes narrowing with something that resembled disbelief, not at them, but at me. Mom, she whispered, are you sure? Yes, I said. Quite sure. Thomas scoffed. Fine, keep your money, but don't expect us to rearrange our lives to help you later. A curious statement, especially considering the documents I'd signed with Mr. Jeffries barely 24 hours earlier. I wouldn't ask you to, I replied. That seemed to unsettle him more than any refusal. They left a few minutes later, tension trailing behind them like a scent. Caroline didn't hug me. Thomas didn't say goodbye. Their footsteps faded, then the car engine, then silence returned. Clean, complete. I stood in my living room, the afternoon light warm on my shoulders. For years, they had seen me as a resource. Today, for the first time, they saw me as a wall, a gentle one, but a wall all the same. And while they walked away frustrated, I remained standing, unshaken, unbent. A woman who finally understood that saying no is sometimes the most honest form of self-respect. The next morning, I felt a kind of stillness inside me. Not the numbness of shock, not the ache of disappointment, but something steadier, as if the ground under my feet had finally stopped shifting. I made oatmeal, the simple kind with cinnamon, and ate it by the window while the sun drew slow gold lines along the floorboards. After breakfast, I gathered the documents Mr. Jeffries had prepared: the trust papers, the notarized will, the protective clauses he'd insisted on. Everything clean, organized, unshakable. I slipped them into a folder and placed it gently into the drawer of my desk. For years, I lived with a quiet fear humming at the back of my mind. The fear of being dependent. The fear of being pushed somewhere I didn't choose. The fear that those I loved might decide what was best for me without asking what I wanted. That hum was gone now. In its place was silence. The peaceful kind. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Mr. Jeffries stood on my porch, hat in hand, the cool autumn wind tugging at his coat. "Mrs. Eldwood," he greeted. "I was in the neighborhood." "Thought I'd drop off the finalized copies in person?" I stepped aside to let him in. "You drove 20 minutes out of your way to bring paper?" "Important paper," he corrected gently. "And I prefer not to entrust these things to postal carriers who fold everything in half." I smiled despite myself. He placed the folder on the kitchen table and sat when I gestured for him to. "You're certain about every clause?" he asked. "There's still time to adjust." "I'm certain," I said. "More certain than I've been about anything in years." He nodded, leaning back slightly. "Then today, we'll review everything once more, line by line. After that, there will be no ambiguities." Ambiguities. A polite word for the loopholes Caroline and Thomas would try to pry open if given the chance. He opened the folder. "The trust activates immediately," he said. "You remain full owner and decision-maker while living. Aiden has future stewardship under the protection of the court. No one else can intervene. Not your daughter. Not your son-in-law." I breathed in slowly. Even hearing it aloud felt like placing a final stone into a foundation. He continued, "Your daughter receives a personal letter, sealed, not legally binding, but emotionally clear." "Yes," I said quietly. "It's all I owe her." "And Thomas?" he asked delicately. "I owe him nothing," I replied. He nodded once, not approving or judging, simply acknowledging the truth of it. When we finished, he closed the folder and placed his hand atop it. "Mrs. Eldwood, may I say something?" I looked at him, waiting. "I've worked with many families over the years. People with wealth, people with modest means. And I've seen kindness weaponized more often than cruelty. You have been generous to a fault. Today, you corrected the imbalance." His words struck something tender and tired inside me. "It doesn't feel like punishment," I said slowly. "It feels like choosing peace." "It is," he agreed. He stood, adjusted his coat, and prepared to leave. But before stepping out, he turned back. "Whatever storm comes when they learn the truth, and it will come, remember that you made this decision with a clear mind and a steady hand. That matters." After he left, the house felt warmer, despite the autumn chill sneaking through the windows. I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where the finalized documents now lay. They looked unassuming, but they carried weight. The weight of freedom, of boundaries long overdue. I closed the drawer carefully. For the first time in years, I didn't fear the future. Not the slow fading of strength, not the narrowing of days, not the possibility of needing help. Because now, the only person entrusted with my future was someone who saw me, not as a burden, not as a chore, but as a human being worth respecting. Aiden didn't know yet what would eventually become his responsibility, but I knew, and that was enough. Outside, A gust of wind shook the maple branches. Leaves fluttered past the window, scattering across the lawn like pieces of an old life being carried away. I watched them fall, one by one, with a calm so deep it surprised even me. Tomorrow, the storm would come closer. But today the air was clear. Family dinners used to comfort me once. The soft clatter of dishes, the overlapping conversations, the familiar warmth that fills a room when people share a table. But now, as I stepped into Caroline and Thomas's newly renovated dining room, I felt none of that. The walls looked expensive. Textured paint, modern sconces, the kind of upgrades people insist they need while borrowing money they never intend to repay. The table was already set, candles lit, glasses gleaming. They wanted tonight to look perfect. Appearances mattered to them more than anything. "Mom," Caroline said, greeting me with a kiss that barely touched my cheek. "You made it." "I said I would," I replied quietly. Thomas stood at the head of the table, swirling wine in a glass like a man auditioning for a role he didn't fully understand. He gave me a tight smile. "Good to have you here, Martha. We want to start fresh." Fresh, a word he used the way some people use perfume, to cover something sour beneath. I took my seat and folded my napkin. Aiden sat beside me, offering a warm, steady presence in a room that felt cold despite the lighting. He leaned slightly toward me, whispering, "If you want to leave early, just tell me." Bless that boy. Caroline began serving the food, rambling about the renovation schedule, the cost of the backsplash, the custom lighting, the contractor delays. I listened without comment. I used to nod, offer reassurance, pretend interest. But tonight, I simply listened and let the words pass. Thomas, noticing my silence, raised a brow. "Everything all right, Martha? You're quieter than usual." I looked at him calmly. "I'm listening." He chuckled. "Listening is good. Understanding is better." There it was again, the little stabs dressed as jokes. He couldn't help himself. Men like him rarely could. Dinner continued. Carolyn complained about her co-worker, then about Evan's school expenses, then about how people our age end up taking care of parents more and more these days. She said it with a sigh, as if the idea exhausted her merely as a concept. "What do you think, Mom?" she finally asked, as though she remembered she had an audience. I set down my fork. "I think many parents take care of themselves long before anyone else ever needs to." Aiden smothered a smile behind his napkin. Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, of course. But eventually, life catches up. People need help managing things. Decisions. Finances. Housing." I met his eyes. "Eventually, yes, but not tonight." He looked away, unsatisfied with my answer. The conversation stumbled into awkwardness. Carolyn poured more wine to fill the space. Aiden asked about my garden, a lifeline of a question, simple, genuine, and I told him about the late tomatoes that somehow survived last week's cold snap. Thomas interrupted, waving a hand. "What you need," he said with an air of authority, "is someone to take things off your shoulders. Someone younger. Someone capable." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caroline didn't correct him. She never corrected him. I dabbed my lips with the napkin and looked at them both. My voice stayed gentle, years of practice, but iron threaded through it. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own life." Thomas smirked. "For now." Aiden stiffened beside me. I touched his arm lightly, a silent reassurance. He didn't need to defend me. Not here. Not tonight. But it was remarkable, really. They had no idea the documents were already signed. No idea that the decisions they feared would someday fall to them had already been placed elsewhere. That the life they assumed they could rearrange at their convenience was already protected. They talked of futures while having no idea theirs had just shifted. Carolyn tried to smooth the tension. "Let's not get into heavy topics. We're having a nice dinner." Nice. Such an empty word when used to cover discomfort. I ate quietly, savoring the small victory of presence. The simple fact that I sat there by choice, not obligation. Their world no longer dictated my emotional weather. After dessert, Caroline asked brightly, "You'll join us again next week, right? We could make this a tradition." I smiled politely. "We'll see," I said. Aiden drove me home. When he pulled into my driveway, he didn't rush to turn off the engine. He just sat there, thoughtful. "Grandma," he said finally, "they don't realize who you really are." I looked at him, softening. People rarely realize the strength of a woman who spent her whole life quietly carrying others. He nodded slowly. "I'm glad I do." When he hugged me goodbye, I held on a second longer than usual. Inside my house, the air welcomed me back like an old friend. They had tried to dress the evening in normalcy, in forced politeness, in polished words. But I had seen clearly. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing control. And soon enough, they would understand they never had it. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between grocery flyers and a charity envelope. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The envelope looked ordinary, plain white, the kind banks use for monthly statements. I almost set it aside. But something, a heaviness, a faint tug of intuition, made me open it right away. Inside was a printed notice. "We attempted to verify the requested access update to your primary savings account. Please contact us to confirm the changes." Requested access update, my savings account. I read the line twice, slowly, letting each word settle. I hadn't requested anything. A cold, steady understanding washed over me. Not surprise. I had lived too long, seen too much, to be surprised by certain things. But disappointment, yes, a kind that lands deep in the bones. I called the number at the bottom of the page. A polite young man answered. "Mrs. Eldwood, we received a digital request yesterday morning to add an authorized user to your account, a Thomas Harding." Harding. Thomas. My son-in-law had attempted to place himself on my savings. "Did the request come from my device?" I asked. "No, ma'am," he said. "It originated from an IP address registered to Mr. Harding." Of course it did. I thanked him, asked that the request be permanently blocked, and hung up. No anger rose inside me. No panic. Just confirmation. Another stone placed neatly onto the pile of reasons I'd made the decisions I had. Still, I sat for a long time in the quiet house, the letter resting on the table like a witness. After everything, after the dinner insults, after the financial demands, after years of soft dismissals, he had finally taken the step I always knew he'd take if given the chance. He didn't want my house someday. He wanted my resources now. I folded the letter and placed it into the folder in my desk drawer, right beside the signed will and trust documents. The drawer closed with a soft click, a sound that comforted me more than I expected. Later that afternoon, Caroline called. "Mom," she said breathlessly, "Thomas told me the bank reached out. He said something must have been misfiled. They probably mixed up accounts." Interesting how quickly she knew. "Nothing was misfiled," I said. The bank confirmed he submitted the request. Silence. Sharp. Brittle. He was only trying to help, she insisted. You have so many accounts and sometimes you forget things. I forget nothing, I replied, and I did not authorize anyone to access my money. Her tone shifted, defensive turning into accusatory, as if cornered animals lived inside her words. Why are you being like this? You're acting as if we're the enemy. I exhaled softly. I didn't say you were. I simply said no. You're becoming difficult, she snapped. This isn't the mom I know. I almost laughed at that. She didn't know this version of me because she had never allowed her to exist. I am still your mother, I said calmly. But I am not your resource. She scoffed. Thomas was right. You're getting impossible to deal with. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't burn both of us. She rambled a little longer, layering excuses over excuses, until even she seemed unsure which one she wanted me to believe. When she finally hung up, the house returned to its stillness, a loyal companion. I walked to the living room and looked at Richard's photograph. His familiar, patient expression met mine. Well, I said quietly, here we are. Another truth laid bare, another mask fallen, and with every unveiled intention, every little betrayal that came to light, the path ahead became clear, beautifully, irrevocably clear. They weren't ready for what would come next, but I was. When the invitation arrived, it came not from Caroline, not from Thomas, but from some distant cousin of theirs who had no idea she was being used as a messenger. Family gathering, the card read, to discuss the estate paperwork left after Richard's passing. Estate paperwork. They made it sound as if this were a routine administrative meeting, just a few signatures, a few clarifications. But I knew better. They expected me to walk in unprepared, still fragile from the argument, still unsure of my own ground. They wanted control back, and they wanted it quickly. The gathering was set for Saturday afternoon at their house, the same renovated house with its new floors and hollow warmth. I arrived precisely on time, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. Punctuality unsettles people who rely on catching you off balance. Thomas opened the door. His smile was stiff, practiced. Martha, he said, glad you could make it. We're all in the living room. I stepped inside. The air felt staged, candles burning, soft violin music playing, as if politeness could rewrite the past weeks. Caroline was seated on the couch, flipping anxiously through a thin folder. She looked up at me with an expression that tried to be welcoming, but worry tugged at the corners of her mouth. You made it, she said, rising to kiss my cheek. Her lips were cold. Across the room sat two more people, their accountant, whom I vaguely recognized, and a woman in a blazer, perhaps here to look official, to give the illusion of legitimacy. Aidan sat in the corner, tense, hands clasped tightly. When our eyes met, he gave the faintest nod. He knew something was wrong. He always did. Thomas cleared his throat, assuming the role of conductor. So, he began, we've gathered to finalize some things regarding the estate. Dad's paperwork was messy, and before we move forward with anything else, we need Mom's cooperation. Mom's cooperation. How carefully he avoided the words he really meant. Mom's assets. Mom's signature. Mom's compliance. The accountant opened the meeting with practiced charm. Mrs. Eldwood, we want to ensure everything is structured properly. Your daughter and her husband have kindly offered to manage portions of the estate on your behalf. I folded my hands in my lap. Have they? Thomas smiled as if talking to a child. This is simply to avoid complications down the road. You know, in case something happens to you. Aiden flinched. I didn't. The woman in the blazer chimed in. It's all fairly standard. If you'll just review these pages. She handed me a stack of documents. I didn't touch them. Before I look at anything, I said quietly, I need you all to understand something. The room shifted. Thomas stiffened. Caroline's breath caught. Aiden leaned forward, eyes alert. I continued, my voice steady and level. Richard's estate was settled long ago. This meeting has nothing to do with him. It has everything to do with my assets, the ones you assumed required your management. Caroline's cheeks flushed. Mom, that's not... I already met with my lawyer, I said, cutting through her protest gently. Everything has been finalized. Completely. Legally. Permanently. The accountant blinked. The woman in the blazer sat back. Thomas's jaw tightened so sharply I almost heard it click. You what? He asked, voice low, dangerous. I reviewed my will, I said calmly, and signed the final version. Silence cracked across the room. Caroline's voice broke first, thin and trembling. Without telling us? You've made it clear, I said softly, that my wishes were never your priority, so I acted alone. Thomas stepped forward. You can't just... I can, I replied. And I did. I met his eyes without blinking. And whatever you plan to persuade me into signing today will not be happening. Aiden inhaled sharply, not out of fear, but relief. Caroline sank into the couch, staring at me as if seeing someone she never bothered to know. Thomas's face drained of color. The first crack in their certainty had appeared. And it was only the beginning. The room seemed to contract after my words, as if the walls themselves understood what had just shifted. Thomas stood frozen, the tendons in his neck pulled tight, his grip on the back of a chair whitening his knuckles. Caroline stared at me as though trying to recognize a language she once spoke but had forgotten. The accountant cleared his throat. Perhaps we should clarify what Mrs. Eldwood means. I turned to him gently. It's simple. My affairs are no longer your concern. I looked at Caroline and Thomas. Any of you. A faint sound tore through the room. Caroline's attempt to swallow whatever surged up her throat. Mom, she whispered, you didn't tell us a thing. You never asked, I said. Not in years. You only asked for what I could give you. A flicker of shame crossed her face. There and gone. Thomas recovered first. Of course he did. We'll contest it, he said sharply. If you've been influenced, pressured, or confused. Aiden shot to his feet. Confused? His voice cracked the air like a sudden current. You humiliated her, tried to access her accounts, and now you're calling her confused? Stay out of this, Thomas snapped. This is family business. I am family, Aiden said, the quiet fire in him rising. Maybe the only one acting like it. Thomas turned to me, using that slow, measured tone he thought made him sound reasonable. Martha, let's talk privately. No, I said, my voice steady as a held breath. Whatever you intend to say, you can say in front of everyone. He hesitated, because men like him only thrive in corners, not in light. The lawyer, a woman I didn't know, cleared her throat softly. Perhaps, she began, we should at least understand the structure of this new will. I nodded. Very well. Their eyes snapped toward me, hungry for details, terrified of them too. It's brief, I said. Clean. No shared authority. No joint access. No obligations placed on those who've shown none. Caroline blinked rapidly. And the inheritance? Her voice wavered between dread and disbelief. Did you leave anything for us? I looked at her, not unkindly, but truthfully. You'll receive a letter. Thomas scoffed. A letter? Is this a joke? No, I said. It's clarity on paper. He stepped forward, anger simmering just beneath his skin. You're making rash decisions out of spite. I shook my head. I made quiet decisions out of years. The room stilled. Then what about the house? Caroline whispered. You always said. I said many hopeful things, I answered, but hope is not a contract. Aiden lowered himself back into his chair, stunned, humbled, and somewhere behind his eyes, deeply relieved. Thomas sputtered. So what? Your grandson gets everything? That boy? He's 22. He barely knows how to run his own life. I felt my spine straighten. And yet, he's the only person here who treats mine with respect. Caroline reached for the folder in her lap with trembling fingers, as if searching for something that would contradict me, undo me, prove me mistaken. But there was nothing there except her own fear of losing what she assumed was promised. Mom, she said quietly, you blindsided us. No, I said, you blinded yourselves. A long silence followed, heavy, stretching, reshaping the room. The accountant finally spoke, voice subdued. Well, in that case, I suppose this meeting has no legal purpose. Correct. Thomas glared at him. We are not done. Oh, we are, I said, rising slowly but firmly. For years, you counted my silence as agreement. Today, you learned the cost of that mistake. Aiden stood too, ready to walk me out. I looked once more at Caroline, her face pale, her hands frozen, her world suddenly smaller than she'd imagined. I didn't do this to punish you, I said softly. I did it because dignity is not something I'm willing to negotiate anymore. Then I stepped toward the door, feeling the shift in the air behind me, the sound of certainty cracking, the weight of consequences settling, the beginning of a reckoning neither of them had expected. And as Aiden held the door open, I understood. They thought the will would secure their future. Instead, it revealed my own. Aiden drove me home in silence, not the uneasy kind, but the kind that wraps itself around two people who understand the weight of what just happened. When he walked me to the porch, he lingered, as though unsure if he should say more. Grandma, he murmured. Are you all right? I am, I said. And for the first time in a long while, it was entirely true. He squeezed my hand, then left, promising to visit tomorrow. I watched his car disappear down the street, the taillights fading into the early evening. When the silence settled again, it felt gentler than usual. Earned, not imposed. But peace rarely stays untouched. Not an hour later, I heard the sharp, hurried knock on my door. A knock that carries ownership, not respect. I opened it to find Caroline and Thomas on my porch. Caroline's face was blotchy from crying. Thomas's was tight, furious, barely holding itself together. Mom, Caroline said, stepping forward, we need to talk. I didn't move aside. I simply looked at her, waiting to hear what tone she'd chosen for this confrontation. Thomas pushed past her. What you did today was unacceptable. What I did, I answered calmly, was lawful. He waved his hand dismissively. Lawful doesn't mean reasonable. You're making emotional decisions. You're letting Aiden influence you. Influence me how? I asked. He's manipulating you, Thomas hissed. He wants the house, the money. He's taking advantage. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment. How desperately he needed the lie. how tightly he clung to the belief that he still had leverage. "Aiden has never asked me for a cent," I said. "Unlike you." His nostrils flared. "This isn't about me." "It always is," I replied quietly. Caroline stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mom, please. You're creating a divide. Families don't do this to each other." I turned to her, and my voice softened in a way she hadn't heard from me in years. A softness that wasn't surrender, but honesty. Families don't ignore their mothers. Families don't belittle them in front of others. Families don't try to access accounts behind their back. She froze, swallowing hard. I continued, gently but firmly. "You might not have done those things yourself, but you stood beside a man who did, and that silence was a choice." Caroline's shoulders slumped. "I didn't know about the bank." "You didn't want to know," I said. Her eyes filled again. "We just thought someday we would help you, that we'd be the ones to make decisions." "That," I said, "was the mistake." Thomas stepped forward again, losing patience. "Enough. You're reversing decades of family planning because you're offended. This is childish." Childish, senile, too sensitive, too old. Different words, same blade. I straightened slightly, not with grandeur, just with the quiet dignity I had learned to carry alone. "You mistake my silence for weakness," I said. "You mistake my age for confusion. But I see you more clearly now than ever." Thomas scoffed. "So that's it? You cut us off? Everything goes to Aiden?" I didn't confirm it. I didn't need to. They already knew. "This isn't punishment," I said softly. "It's protection. For me and for what I've built." "And what about us?" Caroline whispered. "You will always have my love," I said, "but not my surrender." She broke into tears, the messy, helpless kind she hadn't shown since she was young. Thomas put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off, just a little. The first crack in her loyalty to him I had seen in years. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't want to lose you." "You're not losing me," I said gently. "You're losing the version of me who tolerated everything." They stood there, absorbing that. Then Thomas exhaled sharply, defeated, but still proud enough to pretend otherwise. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, "but you might." I closed the door slowly, not to shut them out, but to give myself the right to stand on the other side of it without fear. Inside, the house felt the same as it always had, but I was not. Behind me, through the wood, I heard Caroline's voice tremble. "Thomas, what have we done?" And for the first time in many years, I felt something like hope. Quiet, cautious, but real. Aiden came the next morning, earlier than usual, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that worried expression he tries so hard to hide. The boy has a tender heart. It sits too close to the surface, just like mine once did. "Grandma?" he said softly as I opened the door. "Mom told me they came by last night. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I answered, stepping aside to let him in. "Sit with me. The morning is quieter when you're here." We settled in the living room, sunlight warming the carpet in long stripes. He handed me my cup, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The house, usually so still, felt almost full. Aiden glanced at the closed drawer of my desk, the one where the signed documents rested, then looked back at me. "You don't owe me explanations," he said, "but I want to understand why you chose me, why you trusted me with all of this." There was no greed in his question, only a young man trying to make sense of a responsibility he hadn't asked for. I set the cup down and folded my hands in my lap. Aiden, when people grow older, everyone looks at them differently. Some with pity, some with impatience, some with worry disguised as control. But you, I paused, letting the truth settle between us. You look at me, not past me, not around me. You see me. His eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly, listening the way only he does, with his whole presence. You've never made me feel small, I continued. Never made me feel like a burden. Even when you were little, you spoke to me as if my thoughts mattered, as if my age wasn't something to step over. He let out a breath. Of course you matter. You always have. I smiled. A real smile. The kind I hadn't felt in months. Your parents. They love themselves more than they love understanding anyone else. And I spent years shrinking so they wouldn't feel crowded by me. Aiden's brows knit, pain and anger flickering through him. They shouldn't treat you like that. But they did, I said gently. And instead of teaching them how to love me properly, I tried to make myself easier to love. He was silent for a long moment. Grandma, he said, I don't know how to take care of a house, or manage a trust, or do any of the things Mom and Thomas think they're ready for. I reached out, covering his hand with mine. His fingers were warm, trembling slightly. You don't need to know everything now, I said. You'll learn. Life teaches the willing. I breathed slowly, letting the next words rise from a place deep and long protected. I didn't choose you because you're perfect. I chose you because you're kind. And kindness, Aiden. Kindness outlasts capability. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard. I just don't want to let you down. You won't, I said. In fact, you're the only one who hasn't. We sat quietly after that, the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything. He studied the light across the floor. I studied him. This boy who'd somehow become the only steady thing in a house full of shifting loyalties. Will they hate me? He asked finally. When they find out everything? No, I said softly. They'll hate themselves, but they won't say it. He nodded, absorbing the truth like someone bracing for a storm he already hears in the distance. Do you regret it? He whispered. Any of it? I took his hand again, pressing it gently. No, I said. I regret every year I didn't choose myself, but not this. He blinked fast, not wanting to cry, not wanting to look young, but to me, he looked exactly right. You gave me something, I said. Not money, not help. You gave me the freedom to be treated with dignity again, and that is worth more than anything I signed on paper. He leaned his forehead against my knuckles, just for a moment. A gesture more intimate than words. Whatever happens next, he said, I'm with you. I know, I whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the porch. A storm was coming, the final one, perhaps. But sitting there with Aiden, I felt no fear. Some storms aren't meant to break you. Some are meant to show you what's finally been rebuilt. The morning after Aiden's visit felt unusually light, as if the house itself had exhaled. I opened the curtains and let the soft winter sun spill across the living room floor. The wood gleamed the way it used to when Richard polished it every December, humming under his breath, insisting the holidays required a bit of shine. I stood there for a while, hands resting gently on the windowsill. The street was quiet. Mrs. Farnham was feeding the birds, scattering crumbs with a tenderness I recognized. The tenderness of someone who has learned to love gently because life has not always loved her back. I made tea, the kind with bergamot Aiden brought me last spring, and wrapped my hands around the warm cup. I felt no tremor today, no doubt, just the stillness that follows a long overdue truth. Later in the afternoon, as if summoned by unfinished threads, Caroline arrived. Alone this time. She knocked softly, not the sharp, demanding rap of the night before, but something hesitant. I opened the door, and she stood there, eyes tired, shoulders small in her coat. "Mom?" she whispered. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside. She entered as though unsure if she was welcome, and in a way, she wasn't. Not the version of her I'd known these past years, but the girl I once raised. I could still make space for her. We sat at the table with no tea, no distractions, just the truth between us. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then she said, "I don't know when we started treating you like someone who would always be there, someone who couldn't leave us or change anything." I listened. She struggled to continue. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "not just for the will, for all of it, for not seeing you." Her voice wavered, and for a moment I saw a shadow of the girl who used to run to me after a nightmare, small and trembling. I thought carefully before I spoke. "You stopped seeing me," I said softly, "because I stopped demanding to be seen." She closed her eyes at that, truth landing where excuses couldn't reach. "Is it too late?" she whispered. "No," I said, "but it is different now." She nodded slowly. She understood. Love could remain, but entitlement could not. When she left, she hugged me, properly, tightly, for the first time in years. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged it. That's all forgiveness ever really does. As evening settled, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, tea cooling beside me, the sky bruising into shades of lavender and gold. The house was quiet again, but no longer heavy. It felt like a place reclaimed, not from others, but for myself. I thought of Richard. I thought of Aiden. I thought of the small, fierce thing inside me that had finally been allowed to live in the open. I had not chosen revenge. I had chosen dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, does not slip quietly away again. Outside, a single bird perched on the maple branch, silhouetted against the fading light. It looked fragile, but it held its place firmly, balanced without effort. Age doesn't make you weaker. It makes you truer. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle like a warm shawl around my shoulders. And when I opened them again, the world felt clear. If my story touched something in you, if you've ever been unheard, unseen, or underestimated, stay with me. There are many more truths to tell,